Right, everyone, welcome to our Remembrance Day, what would have been our liturgy this morning. Very different this year for obvious reasons. We can't clearly be on the yard together during our minute silence. We will do that later on. I'll explain that in a little while. Even though we're not there to do it in person together, we still think it's really important that we mark the occasion, that we recognise the sacrifice that the men and women of all wars and conflicts over the past few years have given to this country, and that we do not forget the sacrifice and make sure we mark it in our own way. As you can see from the screen, I've called this session Voices, mainly because when I was sitting trying to think about what we should focus on, I thought, well, there's a lot of times where, and I do this, I know in my lessons, where you talk about statistics and numbers, and this many men were killed and that many men were injured and so on. And it's in a way a real shame, because it's very easy to forget that those numbers, behind each of those numbers, is a man and a family, and a man who had dreams and hopes and aspirations and children who won't get to play with their dad anymore. And they lost that voice. And there are certain people, whether they fought in the war with them, which we'll see in a second, or have remembered it later on, who try to give voices to those men who lost their voice on the day they gave the ultimate sacrifice. So I want to look in a little bit of detail today about some of those voices and how as a society we've come together to try and give those people a voice. And it starts off by showing you this video clip, which I think sort of sets it up quite nicely for us. Pause, reflect, remember. And I think that's a really important message of this time of remembrance. The fact that it's, with all the things going on in the world, all the media, all the news and so on, it's very easy for us to not take the time to pause and to think about the sacrifice these men gave, and how easy, like on that clip, it would be to almost forget them very quickly. And if we don't remember them, the men who were with them are gone and can't remember them either. So I need us to take some time today to pause and reflect and remember. And if you like, probably the main example of a voiceless nation is sort of demonstrated in a famous grave which is inside Westminster Abbey, just in through the door as you go in. And it's called the Grave of the Unknown Warrior. And I talked earlier on about the men not having a voice any longer, but nor do their families. If you have nowhere to visit for your loved one, nowhere to go for your husband or your father or your brother, you lose any capacity to grieve, really, that your voice has been taken away. So as you'll see in a second, the government set up back in the 1920s, a grave of a soldier they do not know who he is. So it could be any soldier from World War One, and that gives every family in this country a voice, every family a hope that it's their loved one living under the stone. And you can see from the picture how it's always decorated by poppies, and it says this: beneath this stone rests the body of a British warrior, unknown by name or rank, brought from France to lie among the most illustrious of the land, and buried here on Armistice Day, 11th of November 1920, in the presence of His Majesty King George V, his ministers of state, the chiefs of his forces, and a vast concourse of the nation. Thus are commemorated the many multitudes who during the Great War of 1914 to 1918 gave the most that man can give, life itself, for God, for king and country, for loved ones, home and empire, for the sacred cause of justice and the freedom of the world. They buried him among the kings because he had done good toward God and toward his house. So let's have a look at the story of this unknown warrior and how that gives voice to many people, many families around the country.
Westminster Abbey has been the final resting place of kings and queens since Edward the Confessor was interred here in 1066. 17 monarchs lie here in peace, but the most conspicuous grave doesn't hold a royal, but an ordinary, nameless soldier brought back from the battlefields of World War I. He was buried in 1920 with all the trappings of a state funeral. 1 million people filed past his coffin to pay their final respects. The grave of the unknown warrior, the first memorial of its kind ever, and now one that's been widely replicated around the world. The story of how the unknown warrior comes to lie here begins with one man, the Reverend David Railton, an army chaplain who served on the Western Front in World War I.
One night he'd come back from the front and he went to where he was billeted, and it was a comparatively still night. The guns were silent for once, and he went into the garden at the back, and about 5 or 6 feet from the back door there was a grave, and on the grave there was a simple white cross which was written in black penciled letters, an unknown British soldier. And that just started my grandfather thinking about that person's family and wondered what could be done to ease the pain and the grief of them.
Reverend Railton had an idea to bring the body of an unknown serviceman back from the front to be buried in Westminster Abbey, amongst kings.
So in August 1920, he wrote to the Dean here, Bishop Herbert Ryle, and the Dean took the idea up and made it all happen.
The Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, aware that almost every family in the land had lost someone in the war, rushed the idea through Parliament. With hundreds of thousands of war dead lying in anonymous battlefield graves, one had to be carefully selected.
The really vital thing was that it had to be chosen completely at random. Everybody in Britain had to subscribe to the fact that it really could be their missing relative, their lost husband, son, father, who was buried in Westminster Abbey.
Digging parties like this were sent out to 4 World War I battlefields. Each had to retrieve one anonymous British body.
The 4 chosen bodies were then taken to the British military headquarters at St Paul and placed in the corrugated iron shed that served as a chapel there. And then it was locked and left under armed guard until, for some bizarre reason, midnight, when the British commander of the forces left in France, entered the chapel and chose one of the 4 bodies at random.
Why all the sort of slightly melodramatic, the cloak and dagger secrecy?
You have to remember that the decision had been taken in 1915 not to return any of the bodies of the British dead for burial, because the prospect of an endless procession of coffins choking the ports and railway stations and filling to overflowing the graveyards would have had an absolutely devastating effect on public morale. And the unknown warrior was virtually the only one of all those 1 million British and Empire dead who ever came back to his native land. So for everyone in Britain, the tomb of the unknown soldier became the tomb and tombstone of their own lost loved ones.
The body was shipped across the Channel and transferred to an oak casket. On the morning of November the 11th, the coffin began its 3-mile journey from Victoria to Westminster Abbey. War veterans, many disabled in battle, arrived in their thousands. It was a huge event. The procession brought central London to a halt. King George laid a wreath on the coffin, and in a ceremony to coincide with the funeral, unveiled the cenotaph, a new permanent memorial to the war dead. Finally, the coffin arrived at Westminster Abbey. The King, the Prime Minister, the Dean were in attendance, but for once, the majority of the congregation was made up of ordinary people. For them, the anonymous body at the centre of things was someone real. Finally, a focus for their grief. And Reverend Railton's simple idea had become a reality.
I think the recognition for not just those who are unknown, but all those who had served, that there should be a place in the Abbey, as he would say, with the greatest of the land, was of great importance to him.
They buried him among the kings because he had done good toward God and toward his house. But perhaps the most significant good he did was in death, by providing this potent and enduring symbol.
Okay, so the symbol of hope, to give voice to families that had no voice any longer, to speak from, unfortunately, beyond the grave for millions of men who suffered during the war. It's a very potent symbol. And it wasn't just in death that people didn't have a voice. This gentleman on the screen is Private Harry Patch, who you might have seen before. And he, for the majority of his very long life, refused to talk about it, acknowledged his part in the war, didn't want to revisit it, didn't want to bring it up. And then he realised towards the end of his life, and he lived way into his hundreds, that he was making an error. He could be the voice for the men and the friends he lost. There was 2 men especially, or 3 men I think, he lost really close to him. And he suddenly realised that he was their voice, and he could keep their lives going and their memory alive. So towards the end of his life, he focused on giving that voice to his friends, and he teamed up with authors, with filmmakers. On here he teamed up with sort of artists who he worked with sand and stuff to try and tell his story. And it's very touching, because clearly it is from somebody who lived through it. But he found his voice and found that very liberating. So I'll show you Harry's story.
We were a team together, and that was it. We were 5 of us in the team. We lost 3 of them. I should never forget the 3 I lost behind me. That upsets me more than anything. Well, they were simply blown to pieces. We never found anything of them. They took the whole blast with a shell. I knew what had happened to them after, not before. Because when I went down with the blast, I don't know how long I lay there before I was picked up, but I was told after what had happened to them. I'd lost 3 good mates. September the 22nd, 1917. That is my Remembrance Day, not Armistice Day. No, I should never forget that.
pilgrimage, that ability to go and see Harry Patch's grave and draw inspiration from it, is something that he was very proud of. And the fact that he gave voices to his comrades and to people who couldn't speak for themselves was a really valuable way of spending the last few years of Harry's life. But there were people in the war that did have a voice and did give voice to what was going on in the war. And there's two men on the screen that did just that: Wilfred Owen on the left and Siegfried Sassoon on the right. And these two men actually met when they were convalescing after an injury in the war. But they were war poets, and they used their words and their talent for description and for metaphor and simile and so on to try and show the people back home that war was a terrible thing, that none of this is glorified, none of this is heroic. It is terrible, it is fruitless, it is futile, and it is incredible suffering. Siegfried Sassoon actually survives the war. Wilfred Owen doesn't. He dies in 1918 towards the end of it. But there's two poems I want you to hear. One of them from Siegfried Sassoon, quite short and quite angry, and Wilfred Owen's very vivid, and again there's an element of anger in there. So we'll start up with the Siegfried Sassoon one, boys.
I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life in empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark and whistled with the early lark. In winter trenches carved and glum, with crumps and lice and lack of room, he put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when soldier lads mark by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go.
Real anger, genuine anger in that. The fact that there was genuine anger that there was an example of people cheering, thinking this is glorified and heroic, and where the men are marching to is absolute hell on earth. And Sassoon was very keen that people understood that, so they did not repeat the same mistake again. And this is the one, Dulce et Decorum Est, from Wilfred Owen, a very famous World War I poem.
Bent double, like old beggars under sacks. Knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of disappointed shells that dropped behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim, through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him, drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If, in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children, ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
So I think both of those demonstrate really well the fact that when you did have a voice, you could make your point. And yes, there was censorship, and certain things didn't get through, but the use of art, effectively poetry in that sense, really powerful, really to the point. These men saw some horrendous things, and tried to convey it as much as they possibly could. Another way that this was done, and this is done throughout history to be honest, is song, protest songs, whether it be about civil rights in America in the 60s and 50s, or whether it be about this. This famous one that I'll play to you to finish off is really about the futility of it, and asking a very simple question about all these men that lie underneath these crosses in France and Belgium, whether they have any idea or had any idea why they were there in the first place. What were they fighting for? What was their just cause? Or were they simply expendable numbers? Again, men without voices who were used at the whim of a government or a general. And it really makes you think about how important it is that these men are never ever forgotten.
Mind if I sit here down by your graveside and rest for a while in the warm summer sun? I've been walking all day and I'm nearly done, and I see by your gravestone you were only 19 when you joined the great falling in 1916. Well, I hope you died quick, and I hope you died clean. Oh, Willie McBride, was it slow and obscene? Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the pipe lowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? And did you leave a wife or a sweetheart behind? In some loyal heart is your memory enshrined. And though you died back in 1916, to that loyal heart you're forever 19. Or are you a stranger without even a name, forever enshrined behind some old glass pane? In an old photograph, torn, tattered and stained, and faded to yellow in a brown leather frame. Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the pipe lowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? The sun shining down on these green fields of France. The warm wind blows gently and the red poppies dance. The trenches have vanished long under the plow. No gas, no barbed wire, no guns firing now. But here in this graveyard that's still no man's land, the countless white crosses in mute witness stand to man's blind indifference to his fellow man. And a whole generation were butchered and damned. Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the pipe lowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? And I can't help but wonder, no Willie McBride, do all those who lie here know why they died? Did you really believe them when they told you the cause? Did you really believe that this war would end wars? Well, the suffering, the sorrow, the glory, the shame, the killing and dying, it was all done in vain. Oh, Willie McBride, it all happened again. death march as they lowered you down. Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest?
This is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure. For death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped the shells, were destroyed by the war. Thank you, boys. Now, the way we would normally then finish this is we would go out onto the yard and we would do our last post. What's going to happen at 12 o'clock, so in the next few minutes, I will ask you to respectfully to stand up over the tannoy and we will play the last post and have our minutes silence. Thank you for showing respect so far. When we finish that off, that will be the end of our remembrance liturgy for today. Thanks, everyone.